Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Peter Adams. If you haven't had a chance yet, take a moment and go listen to part 1. If you have already, here's side 2.
So when I came back to photography, full time as a professional, it was so high on my list of projects that I wanted to do, just because it had made such an impact in my personal life and my professional life. And I knew the story, I knew the power of open source. And, I just couldn't believe that there was, effectively zero photography documenting this amazing community of people doing this amazing work. So that was where I dove into it.
Yeah, the story of open source is so much told through code, I guess as a medium of expression perhaps, but having, other media forms capturing that same essence is, I think, a nice way to fill it out a little bit, right?
Yeah, I mean, as much as it's code and projects, I mean, open source is really all about the people, because without the people, there would be no code, but without the personal stories of why people invest their time and energy in open source, it's that personal experience that leads people to open source. That's what I found in my travels and talking to people. People don't go into open source like they go into a profession saying, oh, well, I could be a lawyer, I could be a doctor, I could do open source. That's not how it goes, right? People are somehow, there's a personal experience or something that has impacted them that has led them to open source. Whenever I discover that about somebody and I hear their personal story, that's one of the most exciting things about open source to me, is just seeing the community through that collection of personal experiences.
I would echo that completely, through every single one of the discussions that I've had here on this show. I've discovered that every person has a story of how they came to open source or how it came into their life. And they're pretty varied, like for you, that was, surrounded by quite a bit of an important piece of history, but lots of, it's in a professional setting and all of that. But, for many people, it's been sort of passed on by their brother, or in my case, or a friend who just suggests that, oh, I think you'd like this. You should check it out, right? It's that really kind of intimate story that we all have connected to it that I agree is quite a powerful force and never really leaves us, right?
It doesn't. It's so weird, right? Because I mean, there's so few things that stick with you, I think, kind of like this. I mean, you're always into things, and you're into certain bands, or you're into certain music or certain art or certain lifestyle or whatever it is. Over the years, that kind of comes and goes and fades away. The open source stuff I don't ever see anybody say, I was really into open source in the early 2000s, but not anymore. Like that has never happened. I've never heard that. That has never once ever been, something I've ever heard. It's, I meet these people, and I photograph people. They've been doing it for 20 years. I've been doing it for a decade. Or they just discovered it, and it's like all consuming. And they've oriented their life where everything is open source now, and their whole career is geared around open source, and they would never work for anything other than an open source company. And I mean, it's just, it grabs you. And I think really takes hold of you. I think once you embrace the philosophy, it makes a lot of sense on so many levels that people have a hard time, seeing the world through another lens after that. Right.
Yeah. And I'm sure everyone listening can totally relate to that feeling. And it's also true that many who come to open source and invest their time into making open source better and building things tend to keep with it until, quite a late age as well. Like, you don't ever really get out of it for any reason. It's
no way.
It becomes a part of your personality, really.
Yeah. I mean, look at the folks at Bell Labs that were developing Unix in the 70s, many of them are still writing code. A lot of them work at Google, but many of them are they're still writing code today, and they've been writing code and doing different projects, throughout the decades.
That's so amazing.
And all open source. I mean, some people have done commercial ventures alongside of that, but they've always contributed to, a core open source project or added to the open source, corpus, if you will, over the decades, right up till today. It's amazing.
I hope to join that group, I think you and I are well on our way. We're a pretty big.
Right. We can aspire to that.
Yeah. Can I ask you some maybe a bit more challenging questions, because they're questions that I think are around the open source philosophy and how that integrates into our lives a little bit. And certainly they are questions that I've thought about lots and lots. So you mentioned how you had that pretty powerful experience around open source and dedicated to always then building the future projects around open source technologies. And so I guess the question I have is, was that a challenge for you when you came back into photography, when you did, considering that photography has been classically such a sort of commercial software, it's sort of a monocrop of software out there that almost every photographer uses. Was that a challenge for you?
Oh my God. Absolutely. I mean, I've been using Adobe Photoshop since version 3.0. And so I've kind of grown up with that. And that's just been my way to wean myself out of the dark room and off of analog tools and into the digital world over the last decade. I've never really been in a position with Photoshop where I felt like I was hamstrung by it or locked into it. But I would say, like, that's maybe one of the only pieces of software where I felt that way. The other pieces of software, oh man, absolutely. I mean, don't get me talking about, digital asset management and,
Right.
Like all the wasteland of software products that I've used over, and I'm sure you've used over the years, trying to organize your catalog, maintain metadata, publish stuff up to the internet, do specialty processing on files or noise reduction.
Mm-hmm.
God, it's just, I mean, I have a folder that's just like, it's just a wasteland of stuff.
Like a graveyard almost.
It's a graveyard. It's a total graveyard. And it's super frustrating. And, it's like you're dealing with bugs and there's nothing you can do. You're totally beholden on the software company fixing it. And I know there's some good open source tools out there, but I tend to, I think, GIMP being the probably the best one and the most well-known one, I can't give up Photoshop for that. And also I have the whole hardware lock-in problem. I shoot with a Phase 1 camera, which is a digital medium format camera. And I shoot tethered, from the camera into the computer, for most of my, for all the portraits in this project and most of my commercial work. And, that goes into Capture One, which is their software. And, it produces the best results. And now if there was an open source tool that could seamlessly handle my Phase 1 and the 100 megapixel files that come out of it and do it better than Capture One in terms of image quality and workflow, I would absolutely use that. But because it's such specialty software, no one has really taken that up as open source, at a level that, would work as a professional, for professionals, at least as far as I could tell. Maybe it's out there and I just don't know about it. But that's been frustrating. I've run into tons of bugs with their software, and I know all the workarounds, and and I shake my head every time, thinking, oh God, I just wish there was a community behind this that could improve this faster.
Yep.
And God forbid they go out of business or whatever. That's always in the back of my mind. Absolutely.
I echo those thoughts completely, because the whole reason I got into open source so deeply was a lot of the same sort of worries that you were just mentioning. For a long time, I started, I guess I'm a slightly younger than you. So I started, I was doing the Photoshop 7, which if anyone, has had darkroom experience and has used Photoshop around that time or even earlier as you did, it's an amazing gift. Like the things you can reproduce digitally that you could accomplish previously in the darkroom, just the ability to sort of repeat those steps digitally so you can create, the same effect on a series of photographs is like kind of mind blowing for photographers who've started in the film industry, or the film era, I should say. And so I don't disagree that Photoshop is an absolutely amazing thing for sure. And that's why, not quite 90%, but it feels like 90% of photographers end up using it at some point. But for me, I had, tons of experience doing that on Windows and Mac as well, and certainly used some Phase One products and Hasselblad stuff. And so you kind of realize that it's quite a commercial industry around the whole photography industry. And that's great because it has really come a long way very quickly. If you look at all the technologies that have had to come in place to make the images that we can create now, you're talking 100 meg files like it's nothing, but that was a big feat, right?
Oh, it's huge.
And the quality coming out of it is like really unbelievable. Before you used to have to shoot 8x10 to get anything close to that. And so I'm not suggesting at all that Photoshop and the Phase One products and all of the commercial stuff is not great, because it is. But what worried me for a long time, once I sat down and started thinking, okay, if I'm going to run my photography business for a few decades, how are these things going to start affecting me? And it was similar to the experiences that you had, early in the tech industry, was that anyone can change anything and you have little control over it.
Yeah.
So that is the kind of the thought process that threw me into open source, and gave me the challenge of trying to create a photography workflow that's 100% open source that would not compromise too much the end product that I was trying to create, especially for clients.
And is Photoshop part of that workflow for you, or have you managed to wean yourself off of Photoshop as well?
I've managed to create a 100% open source workflow, which is no small thing. Like, you're saying, wow, because you know what?
That's super impressive.
You know what goes into it, but it's not without its compromises, right? Like software like the GIMP or Krita are really impressive. The minds that have gone into making that, I can't even imagine how many hours went into creating that kind of stuff. And yet, just because of the nature of it, they're implementing features all the time, but it's still not at the same place that some of the commercial software is, right? And you know that well, you're using this stuff on a daily basis. And so it has its compromises. I would say the piece of software that's made it all happen for me is a piece of software called Darktable, that has come a long way in the last 7 or so years. And I would say now I end up spending 70% of my time there.
Interesting.
And for anyone who knows photography software, it's much like Lightroom. It's almost like a Lightroom analog or alternative. But not all photographers can accomplish what they need to in that one piece of software, because it's designed to accomplish, a certain workflow, and it'll get you so far.
I wonder if does it handle Phase One files? Do you know?
I don't know it, but I have a feeling that you and I, after this conversation, might dive in and go learn that.
Yes, I think I may.
I think on my wish list is to have a conversation much like this with some of the people there who are creating Darktable and have dedicated to making that wonderful piece of software. But yeah, maybe it is the next step for you in sort of pushing those beliefs. But I really don't know. I mean, the Phase One stuff is pretty specialized. I know it's easy enough for people in open source to sort of deconstruct, files from Canon cameras and Nikon cameras because there's a huge user base, right? But I really don't know what it's like for the Phase products, for instance. But hopefully, there's some incentive.
Yeah. I mean, I'll take a look at it. I mean, I think it's going to happen for me where I think the open source tools will at some point have, the critical mass of features that I need and rely on. And I could start to use those because I mean, Photoshop is adding features at such a rate, and features that I just don't use.
Fair enough.
This is the whole like Microsoft Word thing all over again, where, you buy it because it's a word processor and then it's, a to-do list and then it's a publishing, platform and then it's a collaboration platform and it's all this stuff that is not a word processor anymore. And that's when you just go to, an open source, word processor because you only need 10 features to do, to write your manuscript and you don't need, the monolith that the commercial product has become. And I think the same thing is going to happen probably with Photoshop, maybe with Darktable as well. Maybe that's the project that really, makes it happen on the digital side. Actually, these days, I think about that a lot less just because I find that the software, for me is working and I don't have as many issues there. I'm particularly excited about for, in the photography world, for open source to come in and just completely devastate what's happening are camera operating systems and lighting control.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
I cannot wait for somebody to, and I have seriously considered doing this myself.
Oh,
starting a lighting lighting company around commodity lighting with open source software running it, because there is so much that I want out of my lighting, equipment, and to be able to do that. I want to be able to program my lighting equipment to do certain things because, like this project is a great example. It's a 6 light setup. It's not the same light for everybody because you have to look at that, but it's largely, the same distance from the backdrop and, you're using a similar modifier to make it consistent. It's just like just getting your lights to respond in a consistent, repetitive way. And you're, with the radio slaves and triggering and all of that stuff is super funky. It's just so funky.
It always has its problems. And I think the skill of being a photographer is to always be dealing with those curveballs, in real time.
Totally.
And you have a catalog of things that can go wrong at any one point.
You have a catalog of things that go wrong, and you have like 3 backups. Like I have like 3 sets of radio slaves, like from 3 different vendors. Like,
yeah.
And it's just like, and you have to, because you could get into a position where like, oh, well, the Profoto light, the Profoto Air is being blocked by, you're in a studio or you're in a stadium and, there's lots of other radio going on and it's interfering. So you got to have a pocket wizard. So you have to do that. And it's just like getting all this shit to work. And then like the rate of features that are not coming out from these vendors is so painful because you just see it and you're like, oh my God, please let me control the lighting temperature within the light. Like, please make it possible for me not to have to cart around gels. Like I know it exists on like the hot light side, but like on the strobe side, please like let me have that. So, and even the camera, like Phase One is wonderful and they put out a lot of great features, and Phase One's kind of a specialized platform, but there's little things that I know like would be really good ads, and why can't I write that code and put that in my camera, right? And that's the area, camera and lighting, to me, that is the most frustrating right now, at least. And I really hope, if somebody came along, if anybody's listening and they want to start an open source professional photographer strobe company, hit me up, because I just think it would be it would be so impactful. I know so many photographers that would be like, "Oh yes, please, let's please do that."
Well, I've got my hand up, and I know a few people who know a lot about technology and are really passionate amateur photographers and really good. My friend Alex, who also hosts self-hosted here on the Jupiter Broadcasting Network, he's a massive photographer and very interested, and I'm sure he would have his hand raised as well. So I feel like, the beautiful thing about photography is, at least I'll speak for myself, is that it can be very technical in a way that someone who easily latches onto the computer worlds can also appreciate. Like that for me was a really nice, not transition, but those two exist at the same time. But also a really nice way to be creative as well. So I know a lot of people who do coding or are involved in tech and IT somehow who are also just in love with photography. So I feel like you might be surprised with how many people hit you up with that offer,
It's so necessary. I mean, also, and you look at like what's happening in the, smartphone photography world with all the sort of algorithmic photography, that's starting to happen now, all the algorithms that are at work. Every time you press the shutter button on your iPhone or your Android, it's taking 7 pictures and averaging the exposure and applying a sharpening and, stitching things together and doing a long exposure and blending and filtering. It's just like the algorithms that are at work there are amazing. And Google and Apple have some of the best software engineers in the world. They have a little bit of a corner on that talent. And I worry that some of these other camera companies, that may not be able to access that talent. How do they compete? Like how do they stay abreast of and get access, to the best tech and the best programmers for the best innovations? And to me, it's so obvious that it's open source. It's out there. So there's so many open source developers that are also, into photography and could be contributing to these areas, that if any of these companies opened up their platforms, even the slightest bit, I mean, even if it wasn't just like a totally, open source OS, although I think phase one, I think when you start the camera, you're actually booting a Linux kernel.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. And I think the same is on Hasselblad and some of these other ones. If the startup time is more than like a second, I think you're actually booting into Linux. And that's not a dig on Linux. That's just to say there's like a full blown OS.
Yeah, there's a whole operating system booting in a few seconds, right?
Which is amazing, right? And that's so cool. So like, can we please open that up? Like, because there'd be a flood of talent and innovation that would go into the space in a way that would be so phenomenal. And I just think like that may be more impactful even than the sort of, image, processing and manipulation side, just because so much can happen in the camera and between the lights these days. That's my personal preference. If somebody's listening out there is working on it, please let us know, because we're ready for that.
Absolutely. And it feels like then it's a bit of a dream that I've had as well, to accomplish, just to grow the dedication I've had to creating an open source post-production process, but to open that up into the entire pipeline, right? From capture to lighting to sort of printing as well. So I would love to dedicate my life to making that happen. I'm totally into that. So
it's got to happen. I mean, I'm a little afraid that like there's this giant sucking sound into my iPhone, and that like, 10 years from now, everything may, you and I are going to pack up our equipment and, go on a job, and it's going to be, consist of 6 iPhones and, a whole bunch of lighting equipment. But so I'm a little worried that like, photography, there's this giant sucking sound into the mobile platforms. But there are laws of physics that are at work, that
thank goodness they're on our side.
that are on our side in terms of, just you want to have a certain amount of image quality in a certain size. You've got to have, glass that's got to have a sensor of a certain size, and you got to have glass that's a certain size. And so I think there's always going to be, camera companies that are gonna be servicing, videographers and photographers. And I just wish that one of them would realize that they can make it a competitive advantage to be open source as opposed to keeping this whole proprietary arms race that's been going, since the beginning of time, and use open source as a competitive advantage. Be the open source camera company, be the open source lighting company, or at least have an open source component. Because I just think like they'll run away with the market. Nobody wants to be locked into these proprietary systems that are so slow in the photography world. I mean, nobody I've ever met has been like, you know what, I'm really, really happy with the way the menuing system works on my Sony, or I'm really, really happy with the way my, Profoto, light works, with this trigger or that trigger. I mean, I've never heard that before. Never, it hasn't happened. So,
Well, I think some people listening to this will certainly point us towards some of the open source firmware that was able to be loaded onto certain Canon cameras. I don't know if that's still true, and I haven't really owned any Canon cameras.
I know, me neither.
But when I heard about that, and I've certainly seen it in action, and I've done some research around it, it was really exciting for all of the reasons that we're talking about here.
Oh, I remember that, and I was so excited about that. And then I was like, I just don't own any Canon gear, so.
That's how I felt. But it feels like, geez, that would be a nice place to go. And this conversation is reminding me a little bit about what's happening in the hardware sphere around computers themselves. There are a few open hardware vendors kind of trying their very best to make a difference out there. But it's not an easy place, right? It's dominated by lots of really big commercial giants.
Yeah. And, and also, I know this, photographers don't have any time, to really, I mean, you and I may, we would love to burn a weekend on this problem and, working around something on our own and scratching our own itch. But, there's many months where we're not going to have that time. Right. So the equipment has to work. It has to be bulletproof. It has to be supported. And I think, every time I say that, I just have these flashbacks to my Sun Oracle, EMC storage days and thinking the same thing. Right. And
of course.
And I just know how that story ends. And I know that this is exactly the same, this is exactly the same issue, just with a completely different technology domain. So it's going to happen here. It's just a question of who's going to do it and when, and if it's one of the existing manufacturers that, becomes enlightened and gets the religion, or whether a new manufacturer is going to come along and
change the game,
use open source and change the game. Right. And that'll be super exciting. Either way, I'm good either way, but I just hope somebody does it soon.
Well, I hope you and I are both around to see that.
Yeah, exactly.
For sure. We need it sooner than later, I feel like.
I know.
In terms of photography, have you put any thought around the emergence of some of this artificial intelligence stuff in developing, portraits and things like that? Because I've heard a few stories recently of AI creating some really interesting, at least I very much hesitate to call them portraits for an obvious reason, which is that I don't want to equate them to the craft that you and I spend all of our time on. But there's some interesting stuff happening out there.
I mean, I haven't really. I mean, the closest I come is, on the iPhone with, all the portrait lighting effects that Apple introduced and, all the algorithms that are at work. And even there's some good algorithms actually, even on the phase one now for long exposures and things like that. But in terms of AI, in terms of stylistic preferences or things like that, I haven't really delved into that. What have you been seeing that has been intriguing you?
Well, yeah, I think where I'm going with this is, artificial intelligence has been really impressive in many areas. And digital photography, if you look at it, it's really just, you and I are taking real life and digitizing it in some ways, if you look at it through that lens. And so some might argue that you can create that digital version from scratch using some intelligence instead of real life. And so the way I've been thinking about it is in terms of what is the future of photographers and photography. And I don't know that that's coming soon, but if we're peering into the future, maybe 20, 30 years or so, I'm just throwing a number out there, but what do I know? It feels like crafted images coming out of some, a few algorithms. At least I see it kind of in the sphere of stock photography first. You have a lot of photographs that are not necessarily tied to a specific person or individual, but are really useful for a bunch of other reasons. And so I've been just seeing artificial intelligence as a really interesting expansion of who we are as photographers. And it both intrigues me and scares me at the same time.
No, totally. I mean, what was that project? Was it the research group? Was it Samsung, or I forget which research lab came out with like the ability to create portraits of like fake people from photographs of real people.
Oh man, yeah, right.
Like it was like these incredible photos that you weren't like, oh, that's like a photoshopped photo. It was like, no, that's like a real person, but that person actually doesn't exist. It's the eyes from one person and the hair from another and the facial structure from a third. And, the algorithms are able to produce these lifelike, very real, photorealistic, images of people from the source material. I think that's fascinating. And I think, from an artistic standpoint, I mean, there's tons of photographers today that are doing such, incredible photo manipulation. And, I think that there'll be a whole realm of art, much like I don't know how familiar you are with the whole processing space, all the generative art that's being generated using JavaScript and, data and using programs like P5.js and processing.js that are doing all this sort of like algorithmic artwork, all from data, which is, I'm personally super fascinated by that. So I think it's going to happen. How will it aid us as professionals? Ego wise, I want to think, oh, well, damn algorithm's never going to do it better than you and I are going to be able to do it. But I think that, the AI will, be really helpful in automation. I mean, I would like to just to be able to go into a shoot and open up a case, have 5 drones pop out. And, the AI is like, oh, you wanted Rembrandt lighting? Great. Let me get in position. Like to me, that's what I want. That's I could see that being like super impactful, but I'm still driving the boat, right? I'm still saying, oh, Rembrandt lighting or put a flag over there. And
you're automating your photography assistants.
Yeah, exactly. I may be more like a little bit more like machine learning where the algorithm's like, oh, Pete likes his flags on the right, not the left. Like stuff like that. I could see that being like really super helpful. But maybe it gets to a place where, you and I are deploying the algorithms and not much else. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see.
Well, I think it's interesting to look at it as a toolkit, really, which is what you alluded to there is the cameras in our hands and the software that we throw those images into, and even, the printers and all of that stuff, they're just tools to allow us to be expressive. And so as our tools evolve, so too do our expressions. And so those of us who I think are keen to stay with those leaps in technology kind of get to create in a totally different way. If we're willing to bring those things in, some people unfortunately get caught up in, it's almost seen as a rivalry, when new innovative tools like that come into play. But if you're open to them, man, can you create some really different things or approach, typical problems in a really different way?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're totally right with that. And I think maybe, the place that comes in first is in post-processing, right? Because I mean, if we had if we had an AI that could go through, 1,000 layered Photoshop files and know all of the layered edits that I typically do, or you typically do on your portraits, or on certain types of events or whatever it is, it's absolutely possible for an AI to learn, your style, learn Peter's style, learn Brent's style.
And welcomed, I would say.
Exactly, right? Because so much of that is it's an iterative process, yes, but there's a style that you have as a photographer that comes out. There's a thread through your post-processing of everything you do, just like there's a thread through mine. And so to have an AI be able to pick up that thread and learn that thread so that it can apply it for you without you having to do 60 edits over 2 days because you got to think about it more. And if the AI is like, look, I know tomorrow you're going to wake up and think this is crap. So, I'm going to delete these 4 layers and I'm going to add these 6 because you really like these in the last 100 edits. I could see that. That could be kind of cool.
For those who don't know photography quite that much, like capturing photographs with your camera is definitely quite obviously a really important part of it. But the editing after the fact is almost 50% of it, I would say. You need both to be great. But there's such a creative expression in that process as well.
Oh, totally. Totally.
Yeah. If we continue with this imagination that you have where that process can be captured and repeated easily, maybe you'll agree with me, but I won't speak for you. But I would totally welcome sitting at my computer less and being out into the world capturing photographs more, if I could be certain that the output was still within the realms of the kind of things I love. I would totally welcome that.
Just as a professional photographer, you're always managing your time, and so many of your shoots and your projects and the way you schedule your time is all around trying to find efficiencies, right? So, let's shoot a collection of subjects together. Let's do the capture, on the same day in the same studio, bring everybody in, because we can just keep shooting and we don't have to, start and stop and things like that. And the same with post-processing. Like, then let's have a week where we just go through and do all the post-processing together and make it consistent. So it's a huge consideration, on what you're trying to do, to get this, to manage your time and apply this your style and effectively batch up your work, so that you can get some kind of efficiency on it. So yeah, an AI could change that game. I mean, that would be super welcome. You wouldn't be locked in your studio, for a week after a shoot, just doing editing. You could actually be shooting every day and the computer could be applying your style for you. That would be awesome.
And if you grow that a little bit and see it as open source AI, if we can build such a thing, man, those kind of preferences and scripts can be shared around and modified and combined and all of that stuff. It would be quite a wonderful creative exercise, really.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, you have like a hint of that right now with the sort of like recipes in Lightroom. I don't know if Darktable has a similar thing, but like people sell, like Lightroom presets and Photoshop filters and, the sort of Instagram filter, effect. But, that's like a blunt instrument, I mean, with an AI would come in and be like, being able to apply selective contrast to different parts of a face because it just knows like you like more contrast over here. That
this specific person needs this specific. Yeah,
exactly. So it's coming. I'm sure of it.
Oh man, you're getting me all excited.
I know. We just hopefully it'll be open source and not some proprietary black box.
Yeah. Not a fan of black boxes.
No, black box is not so good. I feel like I've been trying to rub, paint off the side of black boxes for a long time.
You mentioned that in the past you've been to a few conferences. Do you have any lined up yet where you're hoping to be capturing a few of these photographs?
This year, I'm just thinking the one that is closest out is the Red Hat Summit, which this year is actually going to be in San Francisco. I photographed, I had a great time 2 years ago. I did a whole bunch of photography around that conference. And so I hope to do that one again this year. the folks at All Things Open are super supportive, and they've invited me. I shot there a couple of years ago. They invited me last year, and they've kind of given me an invitation for this year as well. So, or hopefully I can do that conference again. That's sort of at the end of the year. The middle, I'm not sure yet. That's we'll see. But those two are ones that I kind of have penciled in, my calendar as placeholders right now.
I was just speaking. I mentioned my friend Alex earlier. He's a Red Hat employee, and so I guess he does a little bit of everything. He's kind of one of those amazing people. But he was talking about Red Hat Summit and how great it is. But he was also in the same breath mentioning All Things Open and how that's kind of in his backyard, and was mentioning how maybe I should join him there too. So maybe if the stars align, you and I might get to meet.
Ooh, that would be awesome.
Perhaps at All Things Open, which would be a real treat. That's, I think, in October, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's towards the end of the year. I know.
Yeah.
It's always I try to do like a New York, tack it onto a New York trip.
Since you're in the neighborhood, yeah.
It's just a question of, making the logistics happen.
It's all logistics. Yeah.
It's all logistics.
Well, that would be really exciting. I think it would be a real treat for those who get to see some of your work either exhibited at some of these, if you get that opportunity, or even just the chance to photograph a few more pioneers in open source. Can't wait to see those.
Yeah. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about this project is open source is such an evolving thing, and there's so many new projects, new contributions, new applications. So I'm always finding out about new people and new contributions. And I have a running, huge research list of hundreds of people on it that I'm constantly, reviewing and trying to find people to photograph. So
great. Yeah. It sounds like you won't soon run out of great people to photograph.
No way. Not with this community. It's a burgeoning community. So
that's amazing to hear. Great. I wanted to ask you a question that you might want to send out to the communities and to the listeners. Is there something that you would like listeners to think about, or to try, or go and see, something you'd like them to experience? Anything at all?
I would say, there's probably two things that I've been, particularly interested in most recently. The first one I actually mentioned already, which is the whole generative art category, where people are using these open source tools, mostly around processing and JavaScript. And there's a library written by Lauren McCarthy, who's an artist out here in LA, and she created this tool called p5.js. And it's just so cool. And it's used to create all this like really cool algorithmic art and visualization work. And there's a whole community of artists, and her artwork also is particularly, and her projects are particularly cool. So I would encourage everybody to check out Lauren's work, Lauren McCarthy, and p5.js. And just that whole world, you could burn an afternoon easily just diving into that.
You might have just scheduled in an afternoon for me this week.
Yeah, exactly. It's like open source art and, data visualization, JavaScript. It's got a lot. There's a lot there, a lot there to like. The other thing that I've been really interested in recently is open access data and sort of open data movement in general. And I photographed some folks from Wikipedia, but the work that Carl Malamud is doing around making the law accessible is fascinating. Like I never really knew this until I started digging into his work, but there's a lot of state law and and stuff as mundane as like building codes and fire codes and stuff like that is locked behind like paywalls.
That seems unbelievable, because those are expected to be followed by masses of people. Right?
And they are. And because of that, there's wonderful businesses out there that are able to extract, hundreds or thousands of dollars for access to basically the law. Essentially to the law. And he has just, been a crusader on getting that, all of this, legal documents and the law online, freely accessible, rekeyed in, typed in. He's got lawsuits and stuff before, the U.S. Court of Appeals that people have tried to stop him. And his website is just fascinating. And I mean, I would encourage people to dig into him and his website, which is public.resource.org, and just learn about kind of what he's doing and support him. Because in this day and age where institutions are, especially in the U.S. here, but I think really around the world in general, are under a lot of pressure, and the rule of law is under a lot of pressure. What can we do to help bolster democracy and access to the law and strengthen our civic institutions? I think his work is more important now maybe than ever before. So I would encourage people to check him out too. I think that's another Saturday you could easily burn on digging into his work in that whole world.
Wow, that sounds like someone who's dedicating their time to that kind of challenge. So worthwhile, and sounds like such an important area for all of us to benefit from.
Yeah. And it's even more impressive. He's doing it around the world. So it's not just in the US. He's also, he was just in India. I think he's also doing it for the government there. So it's a global crusade, if you will. And I think he's really at the forefront of this. So it's definitely worth taking a look at his work and digging into that website.
Yeah, and it sounds like work that feels like we need more now around the world than ever, really, with things going digital and some of the unfortunate directions that some governments have been going with data and data hoarding and protection and that kind of stuff. So I really welcome that sharing.
If you're going to have a democracy, and you certainly want the law to be accessible, right? So seems obvious, but
it does.
But it's not. It's great. It's crazy. Carl knows that better than anybody, I think. So.
Oh man, I wonder what inspired him to kind of dedicate his time to this. That would be an equally great chat, I think.
He has a fascinating story, and it goes back I won't spoil it as you dig into it, but it goes back to the early days of commercial internet in the 90s, getting the SEC Edgar filing database online, and so he's got a really rich history doing this for a long time. So it's cool stuff.
It reminds me of some of the work that's happening like at the EFF and the Software Freedom Conservancy and those kind of organizations that I think often we just take for granted that they exist, and yet I think we shouldn't. Like, they're doing work that probably a lot of us hold dear to our hearts and really believe in, but just don't have the time or the expertise to do ourselves, right? So we got to support these organizations and these people as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, the two biggest ones in the sort of open data world and sort of open knowledge access, Wikipedia is just incredible. Obviously, that's the one that everybody knows. The Internet Archive also, I mean, people have probably interacted with the Internet Archive through the Wayback Machine and looking for, I was looking for a web page that no longer exists anymore, maybe, but, or your high school MySpace page or whatever, whatever it is that you're trying to find from, make sure it is or is not accessible. But the Internet Archive also has all this amazing, they have an entire scanning operation, and they're scanning in books, they're scanning in recordings lifted from 45, vinyl. I mean, it's incredible the archive, what's in that archive, the classic computer games, which is actually one of my favorite old console games, that used to play in the arcades. Those are all accessible in the Internet Archive. And it's just, this stuff is, as wonderful as the web is, the one thing, that is not built into it is archival. So, the web is constantly growing and dying, and parts of it are fading away. And the Internet Archive is kind of, has stepped in and really is the mechanism that is filling that gap. But it's also the mechanism filling that gap for the world's libraries with books that are out of print. And
public domain and all of that.
Yeah, and not just that, but also and software as well, old software. So it's fascinating. You could spend an entire, way more than a Saturday. You could spend your whole weekend in the Internet Archive, or your whole month in the Internet Archive. But I just think like those things they're a little bit of the personification of open source, like not just from the data, but also a lot of the technology that's used to operate all that stuff is, there's open source underneath all that too. So it's an accessible thing for a lot of people can really wrap their head around it.
Aren't we lucky?
I know, it's cool. That's cool stuff.
Have you considered doing a self-portrait of yourself for this Faces of Open Source project? Because it sounds like you're an important piece of that as well.
That's a great question. I have not considered doing that.
Would you?
I would consider it, but I would say I'm slightly uncomfortable in terms of my contributions compared to the contributions of the people that are being photographed. So much of I try hard as a photographer not to insert myself into the story, right? Just because I think it changes the story. And I realize in this case, there's some open source, nature to what's happening here, but for the most part, it's a documentary project, and just like a documentary filmmaker wouldn't write themselves into the script of a documentary necessarily, unless you're Werner Herzog or certain documentary filmmakers do that, and it works out. Michael Moore and folks do a great job of doing that. I haven't felt like I would add anything to the project by being a part of it. But I have to admit, I've never really spent a lot of time considering it.
I appreciate your perspective there, because when you said inserting yourself into it changes the project, I think you're completely right. I think, as you know, there are many photographers in the industry who sort of lead with ego first, and that often is attractive and useful in many ways, and yet changes the work, right? And if you are trying to be a bit more documentary in nature and complementary to the people in front of the camera, instead of focusing on yourself, I could see why that would change things. So your answer is making me reflect even more on my question, which is it's a good sign. So yeah, I appreciate that answer for sure.
It just changes the dynamic a little bit.
Certainly.
I'd have to think about it more, but I've never considered doing that for other projects. I think, if it was, if I was a significant contributor to some massive open source thing and, or something like that, and the fact that I was included made the project possible or something like that, then maybe, but I don't think any of that is happening here with this project.
Well, I think what's interesting, and really what the crux of my question was, is just to sort of nudge you towards a little bit of self-reflection and to acknowledge that the project you're doing here is really important, and it's a bit of a gift to the open source community, and there's real personality in those photographs, and I think that's what really drew me to them. I've looked at a number of photographs in my day, and the thing that attracted me to the series you've created is that you can read the person's personality in each of the photographs that you've done of them, and that is not always that straightforward or that easy to accomplish. And so browsing through the photographs, even if you don't recognize the people, it's really fun to go through and see sort of the different types of personalities that are included in this wild and crazy thing we call open source. But also you get to sort of click on these faces and learn about the people and be surprised about where they've put their time and how much history they may have, or, how young they might be and are totally diving in. So it felt, to me, at least when I've been going through it, and it takes a few sessions because there's a lot of them, but it feels like a total ride and an education in just everyone who's made what we're living possible. So I found it really super fun, super entertaining. So from that angle too, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm I love hearing that, and I'm so glad that you're digging it. It is fun to learn about the people. I try to include in the captions that we do something also, about the person's extracurricular activities, if you will, because what's also really interesting about the people in the project is that a good number of them do way more than just open source, right? Like they may have a whole nother superpower that is not even, you would never think, whether it's Ken Thompson invented Unix, with Dennis Ritchie, but Ken is also, an accomplished, pilot.
Yeah, one thing I've mentioned here before is what I'm really fascinated in, and that you're discovering as well, is that juxtaposition between all of a person's experience and the contributions they make to a great number of areas in life, right? And that's what makes us all quite unique, and I feel really fascinating. Every single person has this quite interesting story to tell, and you're helping to tell that in a little way. Peter, if people wanted to get connected with you, or to see some of these photographs, where would they go for that?
I mean, the best place to view the project is online at facesofOpenSource.com. And, all the portraits, I put all the portraits up there, and you can kind of click through the slideshow of them all with the captions. And there's links there back to my professional photography website as well. So if you want to see more photography, there have been some interesting sort of adjunct projects that have come out of this that I have on my on my peteradamsphoto.com website.
Yeah, I was digging into those a little earlier. There's one on printed circuits, which is it's like portraits of circuit boards, which is really fabulous and really interesting.
Yeah, we could talk for another hour about that.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for connecting with me and for chatting about some of your life's experience in open source and this photography project. It's been really fun.
Hey, man, thank you for having me, and it's been an honor to spend some time talking to you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and hopefully maybe we get to meet at some of these conferences at one point. That would be a real treat.
Yes, let's make that happen.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thanks, Peter.